to just follow along the recording, the slides, any tools or worksheets that we talk about today, you're definitely going to be getting after the session to refer to after the summit. So my name is Amanda Liao. I am the communications manager at Spur Local. I use she and they pronouns. And again, in the session, how we're going to kind of just talk through this is one, diving into better understanding who our audience is, so that we know what data we want to be getting from them, where to source some of that data. Secondly, going through some of the channels that are more popular for us to use, like social media and email, what kinds of data pieces we want to be pulling from there. And then finally, at the very end, just kind of coming together to talk about how to apply some of the data that we're seeing to the communication strategy that we have and that we want to shape. If at any point you have questions, we're going to have some time for questions at the end. But again, we're covering quite a lot of information here. So feel free to be adding things in the chat, and then I'll see and respond to them as I can. So one of the first things we all know, right, as communications people, as people who are doing this work at nonprofits, data is important. Understanding our audiences is important. But what are some of the primary goals that we can go into that sort of project with? Being clear on what some of our goals are when we're trying to dive into the data that we pull is going to help inform what data we think is most important to know, and then therefore how we plan to use that information. So as just a couple of large ways that we can frame approaching this project, one, we can use data to inform our supporters, keep them updated over the long term, cultivate their interest and things like that. Two, we can activate them by asking them to do something or take action, having data on how they like to engage, what kinds of actions they've historically taken with us. That's all going to be useful information to know so that we can frame our ask a little better. Three, we can use data to give our audience content. This is especially important if, for many of us, we want to build up our group of advocates, our champions, right? So are we encouraging our audience to share content with their networks so they can become advocates for us? And then finally, inviting our audience to things. How can we kind of build community around the things we're inviting them to, like events? How can we stay connected with them? And also maybe how can we encourage them to stay connected with each other? That's another piece of it too. So diving into part one, understanding our audience. What are the types of data that we can gather on our audience? Here on the slide, we just have three big buckets that you can think about. And they usually fall within one of two types of data categories that you can think of. So the first is qualitative data. So data where, at least for our purposes, you're more likely to infer information about your audience from. And the second is quantitative data, or more of the hard numbers, typically the metrics that you're tracking to see how people are engaging with you. So within the first bucket, demographics. This is good information to just know who is your audience, who are the people making that up. It can be their demographic characteristics like gender, age, their occupation, their interests, maybe what other organizations they're involved with. And this kind of data you can collect on a large scale fairly quickly on some of the platforms that we're already on. So like your social media, for instance, if you go into your Instagram analytics, they're going to tell you maybe you're reaching like 64% women, that sort of thing. So they'll have that data for you on a large level, but you can also collect this data one-on-one. That's a little bit more painstaking, but it's useful if, say, you want to take a representative sample of the audience that you're really trying to dive deeply into. Like if you want to take 20 of your most engaged followers, you can kind of go into their profiles, see a little bit more about who they are, do some of that research and data gathering. The second bucket is content. So what are you sharing that your audience is engaging with? It can be really helpful to know what that baseline is for your organization. And especially if you're giving content for people to share. Are they sharing that content? If so, what are they most likely to share? So a couple things to look at here is just one, the topics of your content. Are people doing more educational, more like storytelling based? It can be design, so the aesthetic of your posts, if there's any common aspects there. It can be formats. So are people preferring videos to carousels? That's good to know. And lastly, it can also be channels. So we're going to get into all of this a little bit more deeper in a couple slides. The last big bucket is just engagement. So how do people prefer to interact with you? What is the main interaction that you're seeing? And then where are they getting to connect with you? That's a great question in the chat. So when I'm talking about audience, I think for a lot of us as organizations, we are reaching a whole bunch of different audiences, right? So that definitely for a lot of us includes donors. Sometimes it also includes volunteers. It includes people who are engaged in the mission, who you maybe want to get as like recurring donors. It can also be community members, especially for organizations who, if you have platforms that are specific to some of the people that you serve and that's how you're interacting with them, that can also be included in this. I will say that because we serve different audiences, and we'll touch on this a little later too, sometimes it just really depends on, your goal for getting into this data gathering project. Like, is what you want to focus on right now engaging your volunteers? That is the piece that you're going to keep top of mind when you do this. So this next slide here kind of goes hand in hand with what we're just talking about. You want certain types of data. Where do you go to collect them? A lot of this is going to depend on the channels that you use. So wherever you communicate with your audiences, that's where they are, right? So that's the platform that you want to get the data from. And also for a lot of us, this is going to be third-party data, which is where you don't own the data, but you can access it from a third party. So social media, as an example. Speaking of social media, you can use that again in two ways, as I mentioned earlier. One, you can get qualitative data if you look at the profiles of your followers, so who they are, demographic data on that. You can also use it to surface any comments people are saying. Are people commenting on your posts? Are people tagging you? Are people using certain hashtags? That's helpful for getting information in that content bucket. And then finally, you can get quantitative data, of course, by looking at how people are engaging with you. So your engagement metrics. For email, your quantitative data will typically be your open and your click rates. I will say that across these different platforms, depending on how well you've integrated conversion tracking into what you're using, you can also then see, from the time that someone has interacted with you all the way through them completing the action that you're asking them to take. If you've been able to integrate conversion data, here is where you can start to see that. For your website, there are a couple different tools that you can use. Qualitatively, a free tool that's good to use is something called Microsoft Clarity. So that is just a piece of code that you put into your website. It allows you to create a heat map of your site so that you can see what content people are interested in, where they're looking, where they're clicking. And then, of course, quantitatively, there's Google Analytics, right? So you can see web traffic data. Some of the metrics that tend to be pretty common on there are how many website visitors you have, how long are they staying on your site, where are they coming from. Sometimes you can also see demographic data on that. A lot of that will depend on the size of your audience in Google Analytics, but sometimes they show that to you. And then finally, with both Google Analytics and something else called Google Search Console, you can also use it to get qualitative data, which for our purposes would be keywords. So what are people searching for to find your organization? What kind of insights can you gather from the text that people are typing to see how they associate your mission and work with like certain phrases or something that you can then use more often? And then finally, Google Analytics, sometimes that takes a little bit of time to set up if you don't already have that. But if you use something like a URL shortener, that can also get you really quick data just to see like how many clicks you're getting, right, to your links. And then depending on how you use these shorteners, sometimes they also have something called URL parameters. So you can add these tracking parameters and then put different links on different posts so that you can see, are more people clicking on LinkedIn? Are more people clicking from Instagram? And then the last bucket here is first-party data. So that's data that you own that you can use. As an example, you own your email list. You have all those email addresses. That is data that belongs to you. You can always solicit feedback directly from your audience through your own surveys and polls, especially if there's information that you want to gather that's outside of the scope of what we're talking about. Finally, the last thing I'll say for first-party data, something that can be easy to forget is just qualitative data that comes through in your conversations with people. And this can be a really good place to start if you feel like you don't have the time or the capacity or the knowledge to work on all these other, tracking pieces. If nothing else, create a system to track some of the conversations that you have with your donors, or, if you're already regularly talking to people at community events. How can you start collecting some of that information and the insights that you're hearing from people and see if that can extrapolate to better understand who you're talking to. So moving on, the first step in using this data is by defining who you're currently reaching. So here, I just want to talk about 3 different ways that you can approach this. The first is defining who your primary audience is. So this gets into your question, Dennis, that you mentioned in the chat. Who is the specific person right now that you most want to be reading your messaging? Typically, at least from what we've seen, the vaguer your idea of who your primary audience you're targeting is, the less engagement you're likely to see. Communications, obviously, you want to try your best to bring as many people as you can along, but the more tailored it is to this answer to this question that you have, the more likely it is that you're actually reaching the person you're trying to reach. The second is by prioritizing and segmenting your channels. So as an example, if from the data that you've just gathered, you're seeing a lot more engagement through one channel versus another, that's one way to decide, you're going to prioritize communicating through that channel. Or maybe you're seeing different audiences show up in different channels, right? And this is common for organizations like we mentioned earlier, that reach multiple groups of people. As an example, if you do a lot of programming with youth and you're realizing that your youth audience tends to interact most with you on like TikTok, right? Versus a lot of your donors are still interacting with you via email or Facebook. That is one way that you can kind of segment and use it in your communication strategy. You can create content on TikTok just for the audience that you're serving versus on Facebook. Something that you definitely still want to do is try to keep your brand cohesive across all of these platforms, but just knowing who is on where can help you focus and clarify your communications on those things. And then if you want to prioritize at certain times of the year, you would rather be reaching this audience on here. You know that is where you want to be focusing at that time. And then finally, the third approach is, for some organizations, maybe from the data that you gather, you realize that your current audience you're reaching is not exactly like the ideal target audience who you want to be reaching. There may be a gap between who is currently there and then who you want your audience to be in the future. So that is something that is good to know now so that you can keep an eye on this and start building towards the audience that you want to have. So in that case, you want to be defining, not just who your current audience is, but obviously who your ideal target audience, who you want that to be. And then see if you can dive deeper into who your current audience is, just to see if there's an overlap between, who you currently serve and then who you're, trying to reach in the future. See where you can kind of like bridge that gap in your strategy as you move from one audience to another. So how often should you be doing this data gathering and work? I think the most important thing is one, just to make sure that you're being consistent. Data is probably best gathered over time, right? And so your audience is also going to be changing over time. Naturally, just because people's attention shift, their awareness shift, there's lots of stuff going on in the world and in people's circumstances. So those change. But two, also because especially if you're trying to reach a different audience, you might be intentionally testing things in your strategy that will change who your audience data, like what that data is going to look like. So our suggestion here is just to pick a slower time during the year and try to schedule a larger audience evaluation like this at least once a year. That can include doing this like sample audience research. Oh, my bad, all of you. The light just went off. Give me a second. Okay, here we're back. So that might include doing the sample audience research and data gathering that we were just talking about. And it might also include doing that survey of your audience if that's something that you want to do. So gather all of that data once a year, use that to shift your strategy, especially if you're already blocking off time to be thinking strategically about your communications plan for the following year. And for some organizations, this might also go along with your budget planning. So how you're planning to, spend money on your comms, if that's something you're able to do. You can do this data gathering at once, use it to create your strategy for the next year, and then see what are some of the things that you want to test? What are some of the theories or assumptions that you have based on the data that you're seeing? So let me just pause here for a second. That was already a lot. I would love to take a quick poll of everyone in the room. Elise is going to be opening a poll, and I would love to know from all of you, like, how well would you say you currently know the people who are engaging with your content? Okay, a little bit, but I can know more. That is where most of us are at right now. Okay, Yeah, I would say so like 3/4 of us are, we know a little bit about our audience. We think we can know more. Um, I mean, there's a couple of us that feel like we know our audiences pretty well. If you wouldn't mind sharing, I would love to hear in the chat just, how you got to that place. Like maybe this is something that you've been investing in for a while, and so you've already done a lot of this data gathering. I think that could be useful for some of us to learn from. So feel free to put that in the chat as we keep going along with the rest of our sections here. But I would say, once we've gotten a sense of how we want to define our audiences, here's where we'll get into what are the kinds of data we can dive into on some of the platforms that are more popular for us to use. So typically that's social media, that's emails. How is our audience engaging with us, right? That's the second piece of it. So in social media, what are some of the things that you want to be looking out for? The easiest engagement metrics to track, especially across all the social media platforms, they tend to be pretty common, is likes, shares, and comments, right? I think we all relatively know that. I will just say, here, don't forget about platforms like LinkedIn, really take stock of all the platforms that you're on so that you can get kind of a bird's eye view of where you are. The second is the number of followers that you have. By itself, this number doesn't reveal very much, but it is useful to have on hand as you're tracking it over time. So especially if one of your strategic goals for the next year is to grow your reach, this is going to be a really useful number for you to know. The third is active fans. So what percentage of your followers are engaged? This is a number that's probably going to be an estimated number, but you can look at your likes, your comments, your shares, and then you can also see if people are posting about you, if people are tagging you, if they're using your hashtag. This is a good way to kind of see, yes, you may have a small follower base, but are they really engaged? Or vice versa, if you have a really large follower base, but you're not seeing a lot of engagement, why is that? That's going to be something you want to look more into. A quick way to kind of get a sense of what this estimated number is just by checking on the percentage of your engagement relative to the number of followers that you have. And I will say, this is also a great way to kind of pulse check how your organization is doing compared to any like-minded organizations or any inspirational organizations you may be following on social media. So sometimes we look at social media accounts that have really large follower sizes, right? And so every time they make a post, there's like thousands and thousands of likes, and that can feel a little bit intimidating. But if you really look at the percentage of active fans, like how many of their followers are engaging versus how many they have, that is a good way to see what their rough levels of engagement are compared to yours. And it could also be a way to then focus on, some of the posts that are getting much more engagement among their followers versus those that aren't. Maybe those are the ones you can be looking at for inspiration. The fourth thing is just looking at clicks. So are people clicking on links in your posts? Are people visiting your profile after they see your posts? Especially if you use something like a link in your bio, like a link tree on Instagram. A lot of those tools also let you kind of see the number of clicks per week. You can kind of track that over time. The fifth is just, again, demographics. Who are your followers? Do they differ by platform? And just a note on places like LinkedIn, they give you different types of demographic data. So if, for example, you want to do a deeper dive into your most engaged followers, maybe you can choose some followers who are following you across all of the different social platforms you have. And LinkedIn, you can see, their work data, right? Like their industry, their title, maybe the size of the organization, things like that. So you get a little bit more information on who they are. And then finally, paid. So if you're running social media ads, how is that impacting your results and your engagement? Kind of like a step up here is if you're using something like your Meta Pixel to track your conversions, that gives you a lot of insight into how many people are seeing your ads, clicking, and then like donating or subscribing to your email list. But even if you aren't using that pixel, you can also see how your reach and your engagement changes the month that you run ads. If you run multiple ads, what's getting more people to click on one versus another? When you analyze your ad data on a platform like Meta, you can also look at where your ads tend to show up most. So you can see, is it in people's Instagram feeds versus on Facebook Messenger? And that is a way to kind of help you decide if that significantly affects your results. Maybe you can kind of just focus on one channel in the future to get the most out of your ad campaign. And then finally, the big number when you're running paid campaigns is your ROI, or your return on investment. So you compare the cost of your paid campaigns to any revenue that it's generating for you. This can be the total amount of donations that you're getting, or if you're running a campaign to say, do something that's not a paid action, like getting people to sign up for your email list. Try to assign kind of a number in your mind for what that is so that you can assign it some value and really calculate your ROI that way. And then that can help you justify like how you're allocating your comms budget. Just as a caveat, if you're a one-person comms team or you're doing comms and something else, please don't feel like you need to pick goals for all of these different metrics. These are just some of the big buckets that you may want to consider, but you can always just pick a few, prioritize them, and track them over time. You don't have to do everything all at once, and sometimes it's just easier to get started with a couple of things and make sure that you're really solid on being able to track them and learn from that data. The other things I'll say is, one, we don't need to rely solely on quantitative data. Social media is also really good for doing things like sentiment analysis, which is where you're looking at any social media comments, or even if it's not on social media, if it's email, any email responses you're getting back from people. What are they saying? How are they speaking with you? Is it positive, neutral, negative? That is something you can track over time just to see what your audience is kind of feeling about you. And then, as with all of these, we want high engagement. Of course, like all of us want that, but there's really no right metrics that you need to be thinking about prioritizing or setting. A lot of the numbers, I would say it's most effective to consider what would be successful for your organization based on the trends that you're seeing. Like all of our audiences are going to be different. All our content is different. So we'll get into kind of the trend analysis in our final section, and then you can see where you want to be setting some of your benchmarks for yourself. So with social media, you're going to get a copy of this social media audit worksheet. It's a template that you can use to take stock of your social media data. So I'm not going to go over it too in depth because it's something that I think you can fill out in your own time after the summit and or work with your team to fill it out if you'd like to. But just kind of as a high level touch on what this template goes through. You're going to use it to review the accounts that you own and use. You can take stock of your audience size, as it is now, compare it to maybe 6 months ago when you last did this. You can select the engagement metrics that you want to be reviewing, do a deeper dive into some of the content that you're sharing. In terms of the granular detail of your content, what are your timings across posts? What are your topics? Are there any particular hashtags you're using or designs and styles that are working better for some people? The other thing to do is just kind of looking at your branding and making sure that's consistent. So just doing a quick check-in, let's say every 6 months, just to see, are things looking kind of cohesive? Are they reflecting the brand for your organization? And then finally, you get a little bit of space at the very end to kind of review who your audiences are, whether they're the people you want to be reaching, and then set some goals for the audience that you want to target, engagement goals for the content that you want to share. So that is a worksheet that is in the chat if you would like to download it now. And then, of course, you'll also get it after the summit. Moving into emails. For emails, typically the metrics tend to be really easy to gather at once. They're all in one place, right? Look at your open rate for emails. This is good to track as an average just to see if it goes up or down over time. Looking at your click-through rate is also useful. This is helpful to compare between your emails. So if an email is getting more clicks than another email, but also within your email itself. So if you're adding links in multiple places of your emails, one of the tests you can do is just to see, are people more likely to click on something if it's a button, or are people more likely to click on a photo, right? And then the last number here is just keeping an eye on your unsubscribe rate. People unsubscribe for a lot of different reasons. We can't always know what those are. So that's a little bit hard to extrapolate by itself. But again, over time, if you're seeing like a sudden spike in your unsubscribe rate, that is a sign that you should probably pay attention. Whether it is your audience burning out in your content or they already haven't been engaging for a while, that is just kind of like one of those things where you can sort of regard as like a crisis management sort of situation. With your emails, unless you're using more sophisticated software that lets you track, again, your conversion rate, it can be really difficult to attribute anything that you're earning directly to the campaign. And honestly, even with such software, right? Usually it takes a couple of times for someone to see your messaging before they decide to take action on the thing that you're asking them to do. So it's hard to say, this is the campaign that really got people versus something else. But again, theories. So something that, if you're already very knowledgeable and experienced about doing all of these different things with email, something you might want to try is A/B testing. So send randomized segments of your audience different types of emails and see if there are any differences in engagement. So the key to A/B testing is just making sure that you're running kind of like one hypothesis at a time. So for example, will a different subject line for your email change your open rate? That's one test by itself. Will a different email design change your click-through rate? That's another test. You can also look at the timings of your emails and use that as a test. So for example, if you're selling tickets to an event, try testing, if you send an email 48 hours before the event versus a week before the event, does that change the number of tickets that you sell? That is kind of probably one of the closer ways that we can get to tracking the conversion rate for our emails. So let's take stock here again. I would love to hear from the room. A lot of us, we use social media, we use emails, right? What are you seeing your audience engage with most right now? And how are they engaging with you? If you want to type some stuff in the chat, I would love to see what some people have for their organizations right now. I see also Dance Place had put in a question about a good resource for setting up meta pixels. I would say that it's hard to get in touch with meta support, honestly, right? I think all of us probably tried to get in touch with them at one time or another. If you're kind of looking at the very like nitty gritty of how to get your meta campaign manager things to work, I have found Dana Snyder's Missions to Movement podcast, as well as she has a kind of like paid course on running meta ads specifically. And she talks about that in very granular detail, kind of like sharing her screen to show you like exactly what she's clicking on and things like that. So that is one resource. If anyone else has something, please feel free to share in the chat. I'm starting to see, okay, both newsletter and email, social media, especially LinkedIn. Yes, we're also seeing a lot of growth on LinkedIn, I think, especially after Twitter or X is kind of, I don't know what's going on with them right now. Business LinkedIn, okay. That is interesting. Yes, I will type out the name of that resource. So Dana Snyder, Missions to Movements. Let's see, Spark the Journey. LinkedIn at the highest engagement and Instagram had a lower engagement. That is very interesting. I wonder also, like, if you look at who your audience is, right? Who are the people who are engaging on those different platforms, how different that might look. Or if it doesn't look different, that would be very interesting too. Okay, thank you all for sharing. Please feel free to keep sharing in the chat. We'll definitely, go back and revisit some of these things if we have time at the end. But just so that we're moving along into kind of our final section here. So at this point, we've done the work of defining our audience. We have gathered the data to better know our audience. We've tracked some of the metrics that show how they prefer to engage with us. The last piece is really just like, what do we do with all of this information? So first, I want to talk about some of the larger trend patterns that you can look out for, and that can shape your communication strategy moving forward. One of the things, of course, is timing. So if we're sharing content at a certain time of day, a certain day of week, or again, a certain amount of time before we're asking people to take action, like signing up for an event. The second big thing is content. What are people most engaged by? I see Devin actually just shared Reels getting most engagement. Yes, we're seeing video get a lot of engagement, especially because social media algorithms are fickle, right? And that tends to be what people are pushing right now. So maybe that is something that changes your strategy. It can absolutely be something you adapt to. Video, carousels, photo-based stories, and then within content also, if you can think about the different types of content that you have. So again, if something is more informative or educational, if something is more like of a storytelling, if something is more kind of behind the scenes, like these are different ways that you can sort of segment the types of content that you're sharing and then experiment with that. Again, the other thing in terms of patterns is just to look at your audience, gauge what's working for you. There may be trends on who is engaging at a certain time in your organization's like lifespan. Are those the same groups that you've engaged with previously, or are they different? Right? Especially after the last few years, we're seeing like social media goes through a lot of changes very often. But it's not just that, it's also more and more people are opening emails just on their phones. A lot of the ways in which people prefer to engage is different. And then probably the people who make up our audiences are different too. So as you surface your data, try to see if you can use these big approaches to create your own trends and then better understand what's working for you with who. And then that's how you can start setting goals around some of these things. So what are the pieces in your comm strategy that can benefit from a trend analysis? Here, I'm going to cover 4 kind of big ways that you can think about this. The first is your share of audience. Who are you talking to most often? Who are you talking to least often? How much is the audience data that you're seeing? How much does it correlate with the definition of your audience that you've defined, who you want to reach? And then again, if you're trying to target a different ideal audience than the one you currently have, over time, you're going to want to see if your comm strategy is actually shifting the people who you're reaching. That is a way to track, like, if you're being successful with that goal. I think thinking about this as, who you might be overlooking within your audience right now is also something that's helpful just to pulse check every once in a while. Something that you can do when you start setting your strategy is just to map out who are all the different communities that you're reaching, how much data, what data are you able to get on all of these different audiences, and then how much do they overlap with each other. For some groups, maybe you're not able to get as much data on them. Why is that? And then for others, are those people that you want to be prioritizing? Are those people you want to think about including more often? So for instance, if you have, say, a lot of volunteers in your audience, but maybe you haven't intentionally, prioritized including your volunteers in your comm strategy, is that something that makes sense? Looking at kind of a representative sample of who volunteers are might help you determine that. The second big thing, it is useful to have data when you're setting your comms goals, and that's what drives your strategy. So if we think about communications kind of as a pipeline, right? How much of your audience is currently at the awareness level versus engaging with you versus taking the actions that you want them to take? So for example, if you want to segment, say, your social media audience, you can look at who are the total number of people that you're reaching, how many of them are engaging with you, and then how many of them are, actually sharing out the content that you're asking them to share, or, whatever other social media action that you're trying to take. Ideally, you want to be moving people along this pipeline. So this is one way to see where is the most potential for growth right now in your comm strategy. It's really hard for a strategy to focus on everything, unfortunately. So some ways to think about it. If you don't really have a large follower base, but a lot of your people are engaged, one of the goals you can have for the next year is just to raise more awareness, grow your follower base. Or, on the converse, right? If you, through your data gathering, realize that you have a large follower base, but not a lot of them are engaging, or they're kind of engaging maybe in ways that are not exactly the actions that you want them to be taking, that is the goal that you can then set for the rest of the year or for the next year. The third kind of big bucket here is just your content type. What is resonating most with people? Is a story working better, or kind of behind the scenes, or like what is working for people? Is video vastly outperforming other things? Creating content takes time, so it is helpful to know this for your strategy. Something else that we always like to emphasize is something called multi-channel marketing. where you essentially use the same building blocks and pillars of your content to repurpose them for different platforms and channels. But in order to kind of successfully do that, you need to know, who are your different audiences on where and what is going to resonate best. So, for example, if from all of your analysis, you're realizing, oh, people actually really engage with the stories when we tell them. That is something we want to focus on growing next year. We want to capture more stories and do more storytelling. Then you can figure out, okay, who in our community do we want to be sharing those stories and asking for those stories from? Knowing what content you're going to create and how you'll use it can inform the questions that you ask when you're interviewing your community members for those stories. If video is performing well for you, you know that you can start by capturing videos of the stories first, that you can then translate into audio content or text-based content, things like that. Versus, honestly, if you've tried video, it takes a lot of effort and it's not really working for you, maybe that's not the place you want to start. You can always start by just getting responses over email, sharing the text, asking for some photos to create kind of a story carousel, right? And then lastly, one of the places where we can see data be useful is just to realize what are the tools or the technologies that your organization might want to prioritize investing in. So as another example, as you're gathering this data, maybe you actually see that a lot of people are coming through your website, but that is not a priority for your communications plan so far. That could be something that you want to prioritize for the next year. So making sure that you're updating your website often. Maybe you want to do more training on SEO and really like having that be the major part of your plan. Or if you're noticing that emails are where your audience tends to actually convert instead of social media, something that you can focus on for the next year is to grow your email list instead of growing your follower base. So just kind of knowing what channel, that can kind of help you decide to prioritize certain things. And then the last thing is just, if you're not able to get a lot of data this year, but this is an area of growth for you, like you want to be able to get more data, your comms goal for the next year could just be figuring out how to install some of these tools, figuring out how to use some of these platforms so that you can start gathering the data, and then you can incorporate that into your strategy for the year after. So I want to end this before we get into questions, just by saying that there's a lot that we can talk about. I think all of us know within communications, there's so many potential directions that we can take, and it often feels like, we need to be everywhere at once. It's not easy to both be creating the content and then also saying like, oh, I have to measure all the data around it and use that to kind of consistently change my strategy. So what are some of the challenges that we may face, especially as small nonprofits, especially as like one-person comms teams? And then how do we think about approaching these challenges? The first is that data tends to be very platform dependent, unless we're talking about like the first party data that you own. But for most of us, we're going to Instagram, we're going to Facebook. So starting with just auditing what your existing platforms are, and then figuring out what are the pieces of data, where are you sourcing them? That is just a good place to start, just knowing like where you're going to be getting these things. The second is that data cannot tell us everything. A lot of how we analyze and use our data is extrapolating from it to create theories that we can test. I think that using data to shape your strategy relies a lot on testing. So I will say here, just trust yourself, trust your gut. At least for me, I know that numbers can sometimes be intimidating. I didn't come into this because I'm like super great with numbers, right? But the way that I approach it is following my instincts on what I think these numbers are telling me, seeing, okay, I think this is going to work instead of this. Let's test this and see if I'm right. So just don't be afraid to do that. The third is that sometimes organizations can run into this challenge of not having enough data because you have a small audience size. Sometimes platforms will tell you that, like for instance, with Google Analytics, if you're not getting that many website visitors, sometimes it just doesn't have that much data to show you. But as I said earlier, data can come in a lot of forms, including but not limited to some of the things we've just talked about today. So if you're not getting the data that you want from the platforms that you're using, start by relying on some of the data pieces that you have, which tend to be more qualitative data. So your conversations with people, right, whether it's at events or if you're already doing a lot of like one-on-one donor chats, setting up a system to track some of this information you're getting from those conversations can be really helpful. On social media, if you don't have a lot of metrics or demographic data that you're able to get, think about keywords, right? How can you be actively searching for hashtags or comments or keywords that maybe like-minded organizations are using, or that audiences for like-minded organizations, are typing in to find them. Whatever you're able to creatively use, all of this data is valid as you keep testing and keep building more. And then lastly, building the capacity to be able to do this work. As I said in the beginning, we all wear a lot of different hats. And I think that the hardest thing up front, especially if you don't already have these systems set up, is just taking the time to build what these tracking systems are. If you don't already have Google Analytics, figuring out the code snippet to put on your website, like that's the part that's going to be time consuming because you're learning all of these different things. So just knowing that spending that time upfront, if there's a space in the year that you can carve that out, if you can find a skilled volunteer or an intern who knows how to do this work, that can also take that off your plate. But after all of that, the biggest thing is just being consistent. You don't have to track everything. If you can be consistent with, say, your top 2 priority metrics, you have a spreadsheet, you know that you're going to be putting the metrics in that spreadsheet, and you create some internal calendar reminders every 3 months, every 6 months, every year. You're going to just put those metrics in there. Over time, you're going to be able to see quarter on quarter, year on year data. That's going to be useful for you because you want to take that at a trends level. So be consistent in your tracking. And the second thing is just being patient with any changes that you're making in your comm strategy. Usually it takes a little bit of time to see if something works or not. I recommend letting things stew for at least 3 months. So if, for instance, you're trying to do more video work, try doing that for 3 months. At the end of 3 months, see how that's doing, and then see if you want to, adapt, change, pivot, but try to leave it for at least a little bit of time. So we covered a lot of information. Just to kind of sum it all up, if this is where you're starting at right now, what are the 3 things that you can do to kind of get into this data work? 1, start by identifying all of the data points and sources that you want to collect. Have your system for tracking and collecting this data. That is already a good place to start. 2, once you have this data, analyze some of your overall trends. See if you can do that every 3 months, sticking to it consistently. And then finally, apply some of the trends that you're noticing and how you've analyzed them into changing your communication strategy. So this depends on, what your own internal cadence and capacity is for it. If you're able to refine this every 3 months, that's great. If it's every 6 months, every year, we recommend at least once a year. But all of that in between is up to you and what you're able to do. So with that, we're ending a little bit early here. I know we probably have questions and or experiences that each of us have that we may want to share. So I will just pause here and see. Do we have any questions that people might want to put in the chat? Anything else that is related to what we're covering in the session today that we want to talk about that we haven't yet covered? Let me catch up on the chat here a little bit. So an Open Book Foundation said they segmented their email list into 3 different lists, found radically different response rates by group. One is way higher, another is way lower. That is a really helpful way to see how these different stakeholder groups are responding. If you're willing to share, I would be curious just to know if you have found the demographics of these groups to be different. So did you randomize who the people are in these different lists, or is it just by engagement?
Hey, Amanda, it's Jen at AOB. Hey. Hi. We split it up by sort of general contacts, and then people from the book industry world, and then educators. And so it was a piece of data that we already had in our database that we could easily segment. And so that's the way we went about it. And so what we found was the general contacts response rate was way higher, educators was much lower, which we weren't surprised by, and we sort of anticipated. So it just helped us change our strategy. So now we email educators sort of twice a year versus including them in our monthly newsletter, knowing that they just don't have the same kind of time to, to go through it. And we tailor the message more. And then book industry kind of aligned more with general contacts, but we also do some other specific things for them too. So it was helpful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That is actually really useful to know, because I feel like often when we're sending things like emails, that a lot of our different audiences kind of end up on that same list. So, that could also be even just like by itself, like one project to kind of think through, understanding who are the different audiences that make up your list, figuring out how to segment them. That's great. I see here also Maria has a question, how do we push out videos more? We have YouTube, we don't have many followers. That's interesting. So I think that video, where we're seeing a lot of people engage with them, is actually on social media. Yes, definitely YouTube is a channel, like a social media channel that you can use. But I think because it's another platform, the built-in audience is not necessarily there, versus like many of us have been on Facebook or on Instagram for a while. So if you want to include YouTube as a strategy for you, that could be a strategy, but I would have to do a little bit more research on who are the people who are going to YouTube. If anyone else would like to share, I know Devin, you mentioned that like video has been doing really well for you. What we have been seeing is a lot of our partners doing Instagram Reels, because Instagram is pushing Reels a lot right now. And then for some folks who have ventured into TikTok, that's a loaded question. I think that really depends on like the community that you're trying to reach and whether those people are on TikTok and if it makes sense for you, versus trying to like get onto another platform just so that you can say you're on that platform, but then increasing the amount of work you end up having to do. But if you're able to do, say, like 1 or 2 minute videos and really making sure that they are social media friendly. So having a transcript, a lot of people look at these videos without having their audio on. Just even knowing like the size of the reels and like where to cut off in the frame so that you're not like cropping people too tightly, the way that you're framing things look nice on social media. TikTok looks like it'll be going away. I think we all have our theories on that. I don't know. That could be a whole conversation by itself. But yeah, that is what I will say for video, but I want to give the space if anyone else has found success with video that you want to share.
Well, we found that when we started doing more reel style videos and sharing them on all platforms, and we just use Canva for our editing to make it the right size. I'm a staff of one, so we don't have a graphic designer, so that's the platform that we're using. We found that taking the exact same video and putting it on Instagram Reels or Facebook, we might get 100 or 150 views, and we have 1,000 followers on one of those platforms. We have literally 3 followers on TikTok, and that same video will get 700 views in the first day. So the platform that I wasn't comfortable with, I'm almost 40, and so my kids are on TikTok, I'm not. But we've found that engagement is really high just posting the same exact video on TikTok. So we're going to use it until it goes away. But we've found that using the same content on multiple platforms, we're getting different engagement, but it's still much higher than when we just do like standard pictures.
Yeah. And if you're comfortable sharing, Devin, I'd also like to know what are the types of content that you're sharing on video? Like, I know it's kind of a different pipeline to be creating.
So this is something we started because of our relationship with Fur Local, like in some of the feedback that we've gotten from you in our training. We're doing a lot more client-centered and introduced the staff-centered videos. So we've done a video campaign where we're making them all 59 seconds or less. Ideally, we'd like them 30 seconds or less. You can do YouTube Shorts. So another platform you can use the same video content on is YouTube Shorts. But we have found that we get more engagement when we introduce not only who we are, but who we're serving and telling the refugee story specifically for for who's following us. But we've also started taking just little selfie videos when we're out doing things in the community, and people like to see what we're doing. And the engagement is different than taking pictures of the event. They like a quick video of us saying, hi, we're at this event, this is what we're doing. And literally those videos are 10 seconds, 5 seconds long, but we're getting engagement on them because they just like to see a face and a video of people doing stuff. And I will say we need to get better at doing captions, because you're right, people watch it without the sound on, and I've found that videos that have captions have much more engagement as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. I think those are some really great takeaways, especially because, yes, I think it takes a little bit of time upfront just to figure out, like, I don't know, I'm not naturally someone who like takes out their phone and gets on camera, right? So it takes a little bit of time for us to like figure out how we want to do that. I will say the other thing that takes a little bit of time also is just on social media, as it is with pitching news, you don't want to bury the lead. So it's usually like, as you said, the shorter the better. And also if you can put kind of your main message or your hook at the very first 10 seconds, that is what's most likely will keep people's attention. So that takes a little bit of reframing. I feel like oftentimes in our kind of like written messaging, especially for emails, although honestly, emails getting shorter have been more successful too. So I think it really depends on what you're seeing. But I think what we're typically used to is kind of setting some context for the story and things like that. And that is all still good, but making sure that platform specific, you're kind of including the initial hook at the very beginning is going to be something that helps with video specifically. I know we have maybe just a couple more minutes here, so I want to again leave some space. Is there anything else that folks feel like is top of mind for you that you want to be asking about in terms of how you use your data, what data you're looking at? Maybe even just like takeaways from how you're thinking about changing your strategy over the next year or so, that you want to talk about today. All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Feel free to put something in there just to make sure that I don't miss it. But again, thank you all so much for joining our session today. There's a lot that we can potentially cover here. You're going to get the slides, you're going to get the social media audit worksheet, and all of those to be able to work through after the summit. And our next session is going to be the final one of the day. We're going to be hearing from a panel of our nonprofit partners and leaders about how they're intentionally prioritizing their staff. Elise will drop the Zoom link for that into the chat, and we'll keep the Zoom open for a couple more minutes just so that you can copy that link or navigate over to the other one. It is also in your workbook, which has the schedule for the day.